thank you for having me. I'm just sorry I'm not there in person because it was so lovely to be there last time in person. I will say very quickly, since you brought it up, yes, so Raphael died on April 6th, 1520. He was 37 years old, which I'll talk about a little bit when I do my thing. So I worked for years to have this book come out on April 7th, Tuesday, April 7th, 2020, the day after the 500th anniversary of his death, because I was like, oh, great, it'll come out in conjunction with this big global celebration of the artist's life. And that was canceled, like everything else in 2020. No, there's still a lot of people celebrating his life, but a lot of like the big global celebrations and the exhibits were postponed. And there was a huge one in Rome that they had to postpone, and then it shut down for a while, and then it finally opened back up, and I couldn't get there because I couldn't fly to Italy. Okay. That's my little short rant about April 7th, 2020. Okay, so I'm actually going to kick this off in a way that usually I start by rambling. Instead, I am going to start by letting Raphael start this conversation. So this is the prologue. Rome, March 1520. Why does Michelangelo always get to be the hero? A struggling sculptor, not trained in the art of fresco, forced by a temperamental pope to abandon his precious marble and paint a wretched ceiling, overcomes agony and obstacles to create a divine masterpiece. Si certo, you're moved by the story. I'm moved by it. But you don't honestly believe that he painted that ceiling while lying on his back, do you? I mean, how would he crawl in and out? His body only an arm length from the ceiling without smearing the paint all the time. And how would he have moved, wriggled about on his shoulder blades and hindquarters? Okay, perhaps once or twice when he was up against a particularly steep curve of a spandrel. He had no choice but to lie on his back for a few moments. But let's bury the myth right now. Michelangelo painted, like the rest of us, standing up. Don't believe me? Look at his own drawings. He sketched himself painting that ceiling. Head tilted back, arms stretching overhead, standing on his feet. So no, Michelangelo was not some subjugated hero forced to lie on his back by an intransigent pope. I'm not angry with him for the story. I only wish I'd thought of it. And tell me, per favore, that you don't believe that he hates to paint. Yes, he repeats the lie oft as the Nicene Creed, but that does not make it true. I mean, during the 4 years when he was painting the Sistine ceiling, not carving any marble at all, he still insisted on signing all of his letters. Michelangelo, sculptor in Rome, as though he hates to paint so much that he's incapable of calling himself a painter. But if you ever walked into the Sistine on a quiet Tuesday morning and looked up at those colors, Santa Madonna, those colors, were you moved to tears too? Now tell me that he could have painted such a thing while hating it. I mean, is that what you tell your children? Find something you hate, force yourself to do it, and echo a masterpiece. I know what people say about me. They say that Raphael Santi of Urbino is the ideal courtier. Polite, generous, humble. They say I was born with such happy countenance that nothing ruffles me. They say my good looks reflect the beauty on the inside. They say my talent comes easily. They say everything comes easily. But don't strip me of my humanity because I'm good at playing a part. You do it too, I'll wager. Put on a smile sometimes, even when you're feeling foul. So don't deny me those same basic human talents. In real life, no one could be as generous and loyal and charming as I pretend to be. No one. You imagine me. Okay, if you imagine me at all. The way he describes me, don't you? Standing in the background, easy to forget, an easy rival to vanquish. When I look back on those years, I picture the events the way he tells them too. Him in the center, me in the corner. Oh, Maria Virgin, that's what I do, isn't it? All he does is make himself into the hero of his own story. Can I blame him for that? But why do I insist on making him the hero of mine? How can I expect anyone else to say, I'm the greatest painter in history, if I can't say so myself? Is there a version where I get to be the hero? Or does he end the victor every time? That is the prologue of my new novel. Now, when I finished writing Oil and Marble, many of you may have read it. As Allison said, I spoke here about it back in 2016, right? But for those of you who are not familiar, just to catch you up, my debut, Oil and Marble, is about the rivalry between Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. And it's a rivalry that spawned two of the greatest works of art in all of Western history, the Mona Lisa and the David, created in the same town, same time by two guys who hated each other. Now, when I finished writing that first novel, I knew I wanted my next book to be about the next major phase in Michelangelo's life, painting the Sistine ceiling. Yes, I intentionally included Raphael at the end of Oil and Marble because I knew he was Michelangelo's major rival during the Sistine years. But honestly, I thought the second book would be structured a lot like Oil and Marble. I imagined this new book bouncing back and forth between the points of view of Michelangelo and Raphael as they went head to head in the halls of the Vatican. But when I started working on this next book, I struggled. You see, there's already so much that we know about Michelangelo's Sistine years, right? And there have already been a lot of versions of it told. I mean, from the iconic Charlton Heston, Rex Harrison film, The Agony and the Ecstasy, based on a portion of the novel by Irving Stone of the same name, The Agony and the Ecstasy. Then there's a whole slew of nonfiction stories of it. These are just a few, including my favorite, Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling by Ross King. So even though I felt in my bones that I had something new to say about this moment in art history, primarily because of my extraordinary obsession with Michelangelo, I had to admit that this story had already been told. Still, I wrote version after version after version of this book. I wrote a draft of the bounce back and forth version between Raphael and Michelangelo. It was fine. It was just missing something, and I feel like it just retread old territory. I wrote a version just from Michelangelo's point of view, but let me tell you, it got very claustrophobic staying up the scaffolding of the Sistine. I even wrote an entire draft of this novel through the eyes of Felice della Rovere, who's the Pope Julius II's illegitimate daughter. Just so you know, this over here is a portrait of a lady by Sebastiano del Piombo. There's debate over who this is, but some people do say it is Felice della Rovere, daughter of Pope Julius II. And here she is again in the middle, which is a little bitty detail of this fresco over here, the one over on the left. There's a little bitty detail, and it's this woman who her major biographer, Felice della Rovere's major biographer, says that's her. That's Raphael's painting of Felice della Rovere. So I wrote an entire book told from her perspective. And that's no doubt why she plays such a prominent role in the plot of this actual book. Yes, I'll admit there's probably an entire book that could be written about Felice della Rovere. There's no doubt about it. She is like one of the fiercest Renaissance women I've ever encountered. But the problem was she was not an artist. And what I am obsessed with is the creative process as great artists create their masterpieces. So I'll have to leave that book for someone else to write some other time. So all of this writing, lots of different versions of the same book, it took a lot of time. I finished writing Oil and Marble in 2014. It took 2 years to get it through the editing process and get it sold to a publisher and get it out into the world, right? So it didn't come out until 2016, but I finished it in 2014. And that whole time, I was working on book 2, Michelangelo and the Sistine Years, whatever that was going to be, right? And I didn't finish writing this until 2019. Now, I've been obsessed with Michelangelo for over 20 years. I've read everything I could find on him. I've been on a pilgrimage to see every one of his works ever put on public display. I've crawled in the backs of library stacks to find obscure sources. So by the time I sat down to write book 2, I already had most of the research completed and in my head. Still, this book still took me 5 years to write. But the whole time I'm writing it, the whole time I'm writing the Felice della Rovere version and the Michelangelo version and all kinds of different versions, there's this voice in my head and this figure tapping me on the shoulder saying, hey, give it to me. Don't worry. I got you. That voice, of course, was Raphael's. Now, for those of you who have read Oil and Marble or have seen me speak, you know how obsessed I am with Michelangelo. Okay, he's my hero. I adore him. Like, pivotal moment in my life, standing before one of his works for the first time, which was the David, was the first one I saw in person. I love him. And it's still the biggest hit I take on Oil and Marble, actually, that particularly early in the book, I'm a little hard on Leonardo da Vinci. Of course I am. Michelangelo is my hero, so his enemy is my enemy. It took writing Oil and Marble for me to come to love Leonardo. And I think by the end of that book, you can see that I now do adore him. But let me tell you that for Michelangelo, in his life and in his head, his biggest, fiercest, most hated rival was not Leonardo da Vinci. It was Raphael. Hold on, I'm going to show you a couple portraits of our hero. This one is painted when he's somewhere between 20 and 22. This one is a detail of a portrait now found in the Louvre. This one's in the Uffizi. This one's in the Louvre. It's a detail of a portrait. This is painted when a few months likely before he died, when he's 37. So Michelangelo despised Raphael, right? Because Raphael was younger, more handsome, more charming, more popular. Many said more naturally talented. Raphael was a prodigy, while Michelangelo was beaten by his father and uncle for wanting to become a sculptor. And while Michelangelo in the Sistine is throwing planks at the Pope's head from the scaffolding of the Sistine, and they're cursing each other out, Raphael is dining with that same Pope. Raphael was famously an ideal courtier. Kind, generous, humble, handsome, like men wanted to be him, women wanted to bed him kind of a thing. He drove the angsty Michelangelo crazy. So how could I, an admittedly biased, loyal, obsesso Michelangelo fan, write a novel from the first person point of view of Raphael? How could I let Michelangelo's most hated rival take over telling the story of what is arguably Michelangelo's greatest triumph in the Sistine? I couldn't let my first person narrator be the enemy like I sort of had with Leonardo in Oil and Marble. You couldn't hate him or being annoyed by him. You were going to spend the entire book with him talking to you as your narrator. You, dear reader, needed to be charmed by Raphael. So how could I get my own biases out of the way? Well, it turns out Raphael is genuinely so charming that it wasn't that hard. But it also helped that I've always loved Raphael's art. it started with these two guys, these two famous Pootie, who I think we all know from like Christmas ornaments and throw pillows and coffee mugs, right? Now, I didn't know, though, when I was a kid, that they are a detail from a larger painting called the Sistine Madonna. But I loved them, and they intrigued me from the time I was a kid. Another one of my favorite paintings by Raphael, which is the famous one, right? It's the one that everybody quotes. It's called The School of Athens. It's located in the Raphael rooms in the Vatican. Lately, I've been talking to people who've said, oh, I wish I'd read your book before I went to the Vatican. All I remember seeing is the Sistine. And I go, oh, no, you walked through the Raphael rooms. You walked through these rooms with these jewels of paintings on the walls, and they are profound masterpieces. This is actually arguably the first sort of perfect painting ever created in art history. Just as some fun detail for you in case you're interested. So this figure at the center in the beard and the pink tunic, I put a close-up of him over on the right. That is Leonardo da Vinci as Plato. Raphael used portraits of his contemporaries to fill out all of these pictures, all of these philosophers in this painting standing on the steps of Athens. So this is Leonardo da Vinci as Plato. This, who is right here in the very front, sitting over this block, is Michelangelo as the very angsty, pessimistic philosopher Heraclitus. And then over here in a tiny detail off to the side, just like he tells you he does in the prologue, he puts Michelangelo center stage and puts himself over in the corner. This little guy looking out at you is Raphael. So that's all, of course, one of my favorite paintings that I was excited to write about. I was also just excited because I loved all of his Madonnas. This is one of my favorite, the large Cowper Madonna. It's in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. I had an apartment across the street from there for almost a year, and I used to walk over every day at lunch just so I could hang out with both of these Madonnas are actually in the NGA. And then, of course, Margherita Ludi, who also plays a major part of the plot of my novel. This is his great muse, the woman who inspired Raphael throughout his life. She's known as the baker's daughter. This little armband right here, by the way, has Raphael's name on it. Raphael does sign a couple of his paintings here or there. This one art historians find very interesting because of where it's placed in this armband. You start to think, oh, Raphael felt like he owned his muse, didn't he? He put his little name on it. But anyway, she inspires many of Raphael's greatest works. And then now, it was always one of my favorites, but it's now on the cover of my novel, which is The Triumph of Galata. And it is located in the Villa Farnesina, which used to be Chigi Villa. So Agostino Chigi was the wealthiest banker in all of Rome at the time. And he brought in Raphael to decorate his walls with frescoes. So here's where you can see it. If you go to Rome, you go to the Villa Farnesina and you go to the Loggia. And then another of my favorite paintings is the Transfiguration. This is the room in which it's located in the Vatican where you go and see it. And let me tell you this, if you haven't seen it, this painting glows in person. It's as though it does have its own light with its balance between balance on the top and chaos in the bottom and all of those colors and that extraordinary light and dark. This is arguably the greatest painting of the Italian Renaissance. So in a way, it was really easy for me to love Raphael and want to write about him. But frankly, even though I loved his art, I'd always had a major problem with his personality because according to my history books, Raphael was as perfect as his paintings. He was handsome, charming, generous, humble, and all of those seem like great traits on the surface. But frankly, when combined into a single outrageously talented human being, they also seem a bit annoying. I mean, I don't like perfect people. I like my people, especially my artists, as messy as me. So I didn't blame Michelangelo for being annoyed at Raphael. I agreed. And that, just as that thought is fluttering through my head, that's when I sit down. I was at a coffee shop by the beach in San Diego. and that prologue that I read to you earlier poured out. This Raphael in my head didn't speak like some stilted, archaic old master. He spoke in this modern tone, and as well he should. Raphael, after all, was one of the most famous, one of the most modern artists of his day. He pushed art forward. In his own head, he sounded modern. So why shouldn't he sound modern to you and I? And he spoke in this really casual way in my head, as though he was just sitting across a tavern table from me, telling me about that time he went head to head with Michelangelo in the Vatican. He just wanted me to understand that no one could ever be as perfect as one of his paintings. And that's when I realized that all of Raphael's desperate perfection is really just covering up a whole lot of pain. He was orphaned as a kid. His mom and sister died when he was 8. His dad died when he was 11. He goes through the rest of his life without immediate family to help him. He had an uncle, and he had his father's old assistant who helped him out a little bit, but that was it. He lived a short, brilliant, and difficult life in the middle of the war-torn Italian peninsula while French armies are marching up and down, invading cities. There are military sieges. There are plagues rippling through, which we all know a little bit more about these days, unfortunately. And then, as I mentioned at the top, on April 6th, 1520, 500 years ago this year, Raphael died young at the age of 37. Now, according to our first art historian, Giorgio Vasari, who of course wrote biographies of Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Botticelli, Giotto, all of the great Italian Renaissance artists, he tells us that Raphael died after a particularly exhausting bout of lovemaking. Okay. There's arguments about what that means. He was out too late. He didn't tell his doctors. They bled him. But anyway, Vasari talks a lot about how much sex Raphael liked to have. And so if you reread Vasari's bio with a little bit of a shift of perspective, you no longer see this perfect, generous, humble, charming courtier, but you see something closer to a modern day rock star. And I'm going to show you some of Raphael's drawings, because when you do dive deep into Raphael's drawings with a little bit of a new perspective, you no longer see work that seems to be too perfect. But I started seeing signs of what we today might diagnose as OCD. When my novel begins, Raphael's father is dying. He makes the 11-year-old Raphael promise that he will become the greatest painter in all of history. And the bulk of my story focuses on Raphael's quest to keep that deathbed promise to his father by chasing, beating, and maybe even surpassing Michelangelo as they go head to head in the halls of the Vatican, while Michelangelo paints the Sistine ceiling and Raphael paints these masterpieces on the walls of the Pope's private apartments. It's a world where popes conspire and armies go to war and cardinals kill dukes and wolves rule the ruins of Renaissance Rome. But amidst all of this plot, because if you've read my first book, you know I like plot. Okay, but amidst all of this, my point is, Raphael was not as perfect as his paintings. He was just desperate to paint over all of his brokenness by creating picture after picture after picture of beauty, determined that no matter how tough the world seemed, Raphael would never stop trying to bend the world toward beauty. All right. That's my talk. That's my like official Raphael talk where I sort of introduce you to who he is and what he was like. Now, listen, I can talk about this stuff for 500 years. I can talk about it and never stop talking, and you guys will never go have dinner and sit down and go to sleep because I'll just still be sitting here talking. But That's not going to happen. And so I want to answer questions. I will keep talking if you don't answer questions. So you might as well put questions in the chat. Okay.
All right. First question. Was his art appreciated while he was alive? Did he die a rich man?
Yeah, Raphael, actually, it's so funny because I feel like today we put Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci up on these pedestals. Like they were the most famous people on the planet. They're the most famous people now. And like now I feel like people maybe know the name Raphael more from being a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle than being an artist. I feel like that's the common thing, right? But yeah, no, during his lifetime, Raphael was the most famous, beloved artist on the entire peninsula. When he died, people wailed in the streets as though a pope had died. I mean, it was he's buried in the Pantheon, right? I mean, he is the absolute pinnacle of art in his day. Vasari admits that probably Michelangelo ended up beating him, but Michelangelo lives for a much longer time than Raphael does. Raphael dies at 37. Michelangelo lives to be almost 89 years old. So there's a huge difference in lifespan. Raphael was a famous courtier. He lived quite well. He enjoyed indulging himself in good food, in pretty clothes. He dressed very well. He had a lot of huge commissions, a lot by the Pope, and then by that guy I was talking about where the Galeta is located, which is Agostino Chigi, who was the wealthiest banker in all of Rome. So he paid Raphael quite handsomely, and all of those Madonnas we looked at, and a bunch of portraits. He was an artist in high demand. He had an entire workshop working under him. So some of his work he designed, and then other workers created the actual physical work. Some of them are by his hand. Oh, he was hugely prolific. He was like the rock star of his day. He was super famous. I just think it's funny that now everybody knows him as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle. I mean, not that Michelangelo and Leonardo aren't, but you also know there are other things. Raphael gets a bum rush these days.
Okay, well, you kind of answered someone else's question. Did he have any assistants working for him?
Yeah, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that because it's so interesting. And please, Ross King's Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling, that book I showed you guys earlier by Ross King. That one is about Michelangelo's Sistine years, but it spends a great amount of time also talking about his rival down the hall, Raphael. And so there's great information in there about Raphael's workshop. Raphael really did sort of orchestrate one of the biggest, most important workshops in all of Rome. He was like the head of this big production. You know, I used to work in TV for years. And I always think of Raphael as being like an executive producer. You know, he was orchestrating everything. Yes, he was creating, but he was also just famous for orchestrating everything. He had a giant, and he's very famous for it. And it's really fascinating to get into the different personalities that he brought into his workshop and how he managed to make everybody work together and how he sort of handled the politics of having a big staff working for him, which I think we all understand from working in offices. Raphael was very good at office politics, not just at like papal politics.
One of our attendees asked if you speak Italian, Stephanie.
Okay, so here's the deal. So I went to Italy and I studied at the University of Pisa when I was 20 for a semester. And anybody who's been, you know, Pisa is like a 30 to 45-minute train ride from Florence, depending upon which train you catch. But the thing is, so my friends who studied in Florence didn't learn any Italian. Those of us who went to Pisa did, because about a block away from the Leaning Tower of Pisa, back in 1990, I'm going to age myself, 6, they did not speak English about a block away from the tower. Nobody. It was all Italian. When I showed up in Italy, I'd studied French my whole life, right? I had studied French in college and French in high school and college, and French I was good with. I will admit something embarrassing. When I showed up to Italy at 20 years old, I did not know that ciao meant both hello and goodbye like aloha. Did not know that. Could not have told you that. Learned that. Okay, so when I show up, I know zero Italian. By the time I left, I was dreaming in it. However, so much of it's gone. I hear it better than I speak it at this point. My reading's terrible because I never studied it formally. I just learned it by speaking it over a semester period of time. So I still have, if I go back and I spend time there, whenever I do get to go back and I spend time there, it comes back. But man, my Italian's not great. My mom's best friend is Italian. She's from Bassano del Grappa, which is right outside of Venice where people have been. It's lovely. It's a beautiful town. And so I did learn with Raphael to make sure and give her my book to make sure and spell check the Italian, because apparently a bad speller in Italian has showed up in the first issues of Oil and Marble, because I don't spell well in English. So I have like 2 misspellings or something in Italian because I'm a bad speller. So I've learned.
Someone asked, did Margarita and Raphael really get married?
No, probably not. We don't know. Maybe. But there's no direct evidence that they actually got married. We know that they were in love. We know that after he dies, she goes into a nunnery. I mean, she retires herself. We know that in, hold on, I can show you these. Hold on. Let me see if I can get back to these paintings real fast, because I can show you some details about her. We know that this move, that she had this armband, right, with his name on it, is very suggestive of a spouse would do that, because a male spouse at the time would have owned his wife. And also in this painting, there is some conjecture by art historians that there was a ruby ring that was taken off of her finger that we could no longer see down here. And that would be a suggestion that they were indeed married, and they never told anyone for political reasons. Raphael never could have been married to a woman like Margherita Ludi. I conflate a couple of stories about her. We don't know whether she was just a baker's daughter or if there was a bit of a prostitute about her. We don't exactly. She's sort of like Mary Magdalene in that sense. We don't know a lot about her, and there are a lot of stories that are conflated together. The reason why, one of the other main reasons why people think they might have actually gotten married is he does get engaged to a cardinal's niece, probably daughter, cardinal's niece. And he never marries her, which is crazy. But politics wise, you can understand why he got engaged to her. And then he just keeps putting it off, probably because he was in love with Margherita Ludi, possibly already married. No one really knows. The thing about Raphael is, okay, so with Michelangelo, there are biographies and autobiographies and poetry, and with Leonardo, and letters, lots of letters. And with Leonardo, there are notebooks and notebooks and notebooks, lots of information. Raphael, there's less information about him to draw from, just biographical information. There's the Vasari biography. There's a few letters. There's the Courtier written by Baldassare Castiglione, which is a famous treatise about what it means to be an ideal courtier. And he uses, according to legend, he uses Raphael as his ideal courtier. So I used a lot of that in his external persona. But we do not have as much biographical information about him. So a lot of the questions like, were he and Margherita Ludi really married? We don't know. I don't know. I like to think so.
One of our Facebook Live comments, someone said that you should write about Camille Claudel.
Okay, well, I'm going to tell you who I love, but I'm going to recommend somebody else's book because I love her as well. And her name is Heather Webb, and she wrote a book called Rodin's Lover, which is about both Rodin and Camille Claudel. So if you're interested in that story, I highly recommend Heather Webb's Rodin's Lover, and anything by Heather Webb, because she's a fantastic historical novelist. I try very hard to, even though these guys have been written about a lot, I try to tell a version that hasn't been told before. So I always try to look for the different angle in. Thus far, I have not found a different angle into Camille Claudel that Heather Webb did not do a great job of covering. If I find one, you better believe I'm going to do it, because Rodin was obsessed with Michelangelo, so therefore I'm obsessed with Rodin, and then I'm of course obsessed with Camille Claudel, who should be given credit for most everything Rodin ever created. Okay, particularly the hands.
One of our questions, what if any art did Raphael collect for himself?
the art of, I don't know that he had a lot of art of himself. Now you're going to make me want to go look that up. I don't think I know he was known for living in a very plush apartment environment. He had a villa in Rome. I know he put up art for other people. A lot of people patroned him. But, and then the other piece that I can think of that's relevant is, so he becomes the papal architect, right? And when he does that, he sort of takes it upon himself to look around Rome and figure out which pieces of art and which buildings and which statues and which things need to be preserved for all time. So that's not that he's collecting art, but more that he's helping to preserve it in Rome. I will say, the gallery system doesn't show up for another 400 years, right? So you're not talking about sort of, there's no bourgeois at the time. There's no middle classes going out and buying pictures to hang up in their house. You're either wealthy enough to commission a work from somebody. I don't know that he did. And I don't know where you would even find that information, because I've read pretty much everything I know to find. So I may try to go look it up. So this is when I always say, keep an eye out on my blog, because usually a question like this, I go try to find it. And then oftentimes I end up blogging about it. So if I find anything, it will show up on my blog, but I don't know of anything offhand.
Great. Someone asked, who taught Raphael his craft?
There's a lot of debate about that. So his father was a poet and a painter for the Duke of Urbino, which is where Raphael grew up. So Raphael basically grew up in the shadow of the palace of the ducal palace in Urbino, and his dad worked for the Duke. So his dad was a painter, and his dad mainly worked in tempera, but in tempera paints. And so most people think, well, he doesn't die until Raphael's 11. That's quite old during the Renaissance. I mean, not old, but it's quite an aged kid. So the odds that he studied under his father and then his father passed on a great deal of his craft are quite high. The person who is traditionally given the most credit, the person who we know Raphael goes and apprentices in his workshop after his father dies, is Pietro Perugino, who was one of the most famous artists on the peninsula at the time, certainly in the central part of the peninsula where Raphael was from. So Pietro Perugino is traditionally given the most credit for Raphael's training. Raphael basically flat out copies one of Perugino's paintings called The Marriage of the Virgin. It's almost an exact replica. He just sort of tries to make things slightly better. And then he goes off and he's a real student for the rest of his life of everybody. Raphael, more than anybody, is a student of art history of his time. He really studies everybody that comes before him and does his best to build on those that come before him. But those are the two major actual teachers, Dad and Perugino.
Great. One person asked, what was his first painting and his last painting?
His first painting is last. Let's see. Was the last painting is the Transfiguration. So that one that I showed you with the glowing here, I can pull it up. That's his last one. He was still working on it when he was 37 years old. And he died. This painting right here was still in his studio when he died. And it is arguably the greatest painting in all of Western history in the Italian Renaissance. His first painting, I don't think I have photos of because they were quite early and I can't imagine I would have included any of them. There are multiples that could be seen as his first, just because he's so young. There was basically a tapestry that they carried through, like not a banner. Sorry, that's what, like a banner that they carried through town for a Let's Keep the Plague Away march. And it was a Madonna altarpiece. So they carried that through town. That he did very early. The earliest one's always hard to find for everybody. Just because you don't, a lot of that's lost. I mean, what was his earliest painting? I don't know. I presume he was starting to paint by the time he was 5. We don't have anything until either that banner or there was a very early altarpiece that got wrecked in a earthquake. So it's only in pieces now. And it's like very early fragments. You can still see like an angel that he painted. So it's always really hard when you're, coming up. You don't keep this stuff because you don't know he's going to be freaking Raphael.
Someone asked, where in Italy is the best art?
Italy, the whole thing? Go there. I'll give you some highlights. The Vatican, if you're talking about reading Raphael, the Vatican Museum, that is the Sistine ceiling and the Last Judgment and all of the Sistine frescoes in the Sistine. That's the Raphael rooms. It's everything in the Vatican museums. If you leave Vatican City and you do the rest of Rome, that's always fantastic. The Moses, and then you go down and you see the old Forum and you see, Rome's fantastic. I love Florence. I have a soft spot for Florence, probably because I did study in Pisa when I was young. And so I got to spend a lot of time there. So that's the David, and the Bargello is a great sculpture museum there. And Uffizi has some of the greatest Italian Renaissance work in all of, the Uffizi is one of the greatest museums in the world, and that's in Florence. And just walking around Florence is a piece of art. I have to say I love Venice too. Venice has a great Accademia of its own, and there's a Peggy Guggenheim, which has some great contemporary stuff in it. Which is weird. Like you go to Venice and you're walking around St. Mark's and St. Mark's is flooding and you're like trudging through the flooded water and you're feeling like you're back in the 15th century. And then you go look at Jackson Pollock. So that's always interesting and fun. Every place. Go to Urbino. Urbino has a museum dedicated to Raphael's, where his father was and where he grew up. And it's fascinating to walk through. So you can go see that. I don't know, Bologna. I could keep naming places. It would just Siena. Oh, Siena is so great. And just anywhere. Go to Italy. Go to all of the Italy.
Didn't the Renaissance artists enjoy a good bit of control over their work? Is this true generally? And if so, was it true of Raphael?
Yes and no. So prior to Michelangelo, Leonardo, and then Raphael, who's slightly younger, there was no like fame culture. No one hired an artist for their name or because they were really good at, like, they hired a workshop. It really is Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Raphael who make being sort of a named artist, who make being an artist this really cool thing. It's why Michelangelo's beaten as a kid for wanting to become a sculptor. It was not a good career. He would have been considered a craftsman. So there's some control to an extent, and yet the patron still holds a lot of control, just like now. I'll reference working in Hollywood again, right? I had control as a producer of my television show, but guess who had more control? The producer was writing the check, right? So it's the same thing. When you're working for the Pope and all of his ecclesiastical people in charge of the message they were going to be putting out to the followers of the church had a lot to say about what the Sistine and those rooms looked like, about what the content was. Now, there are different approaches to it, right? Of course, Raphael had a lot of control over the artistic interpretation of the events he was supposed to portray. Otherwise, you wouldn't have hired an artist. You just would have shoved something up there. They wanted a masterpiece. Michelangelo famously, when he was given drawings by the team at the Sistine, here's what you should do to the ceiling, he ripped them up and threw them out and said, no, we can do better than that. And then that's how you get the Sistine, because he said, no, that's too easy. We need to put in images and we need to fill it. We need to really go over the top. So it's a complicated answer that I refuse to come down. Yes, control, and yes, they had artistic license to an extent, but the person who has the money bags gets what he wants. And certainly when that person's the Pope.
Okay, Stephanie, you might not be able to give any hints, or maybe you just give us a hint. We've had several people ask, are you working on a new book now, or what is it about?
So I am working, of course, I'm always working on a new book. But by the way, I'm slow. I don't churn out a new book every year. I'm convinced that it's partially because, I produced TV for 5 nights a week for almost 20 years. So I would churn out a new episode, and that's great. And there's a joy and a freedom to that. But then I get to my books and I'm like, I don't need to churn. I don't want to just churn out a book and a book. I want to make it what I want it, what I want to make it. And I want to, as I said earlier about Camille Claudel, I want to write something that no one else has really quite given us quite that perspective on yet. So I'm not fast. Don't be like going, ooh, great, 2021, new book. No, it's not going to be one. I'm working on getting it done by the end of 2021, but then there's a whole publishing process, the whole thing. Okay. So what is it about? I hope to be writing art historical fiction until the day I die. Like Michelangelo, who was 89 and he was arthritic and he couldn't see and he had a goiter and he's still carving marble the week before he dies at 89. Like he's still pounding into a pieta. It's me in art historical fiction. I'm still going to be like writing at 80, however old, I don't know, whenever I die, writing that till I die. But for the next one, I am for a moment leaving the Italian Renaissance, not because I won't be back. I am obsessed with the era, but because I have other things I'm also obsessed with and interested in exploring. And so I'm going to go do that. So I'm leaving both country and era for the next one. I used to tell people, go on my social media. I'm obsessed with a certain time period right now. But right now, social media is weird because we're all stuck indoors. So there's really, you can't see which like exhibits I'm going on. You used to see, oh, she's going to this exhibit and this exhibit and this, oh, it must be this time period. I'm not traveling or leaving my house like the rest of you. So my social media is not quite so much of a clue anymore. Different time period, different country. That's what I'm going to tell you for now. It's exciting. I'm excited about it.
Yeah, we look forward to hearing about your next book or whenever that comes out. We have 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up for the evening. One is, what is your favorite restaurant in Italy?
Oh, well, I'm going to say I have a lot of favorite restaurants in Italy because Italy is fantastic. But I will give the plug to Buffetto, which is a pizza restaurant off of Piazza Novana in Rome. So if you go to Piazza Novana, you go off one of the side streets, it's this restaurant, it's this pizzeria called Buffetto. And if you have to get there early because there's always a line outside to get in, and you pack in at tables with other locals, and the waiter comes over and he speaks like The Godfather, only in Italian. And then they slide the pizza into this big old 1,000-year-old oven. And it's like the perfect pizza ever created and the perfect atmosphere. And you feel like you're in Italy, and it's simple and it's good. And you drink wine with other Italians and you eat some of the best pizza I've ever had in my life. So Buffetto, I'll do that.
Okay. Thank you. Our final question for tonight: did Raphael's interpretation or depiction of religious subject matter ever differ from what the Pope deemed accurate? In other words, was his subject matter ever controversial?
I hate to say, when you're working for the Pope, you don't, and okay, and not only that, let me be specific about this here. This one, right? So the School of Athens, this painting, and all of these paintings, all of these paintings are literally in the Pope's private rooms. These are not painted on a random wall. These are Pope Julius II's private rooms. This painting, which is called the Dispita, and the School of Athens, are both in what was going to become the library, or what was the library. It was also the room of the signing, Stanza della Segnatura. This it is a depiction of the expulsion of Heliodorus. which a thief comes in and tries to steal money that was supposed to be given to orphans, and God sent an angel to kick him out of the temple and save the money. This is one of Pope Julius II's favorite personal miracles, called the Mass at Bolsena, when like the blood actually, when the bread actually bleeds, kind of thing. And this is a picture of Pope Julius kneeling at it, even though technically he wasn't there. When you are decorating the Pope's private apartments, you aren't putting something controversial up on the walls. Raphael kept that job working for the Pope until he died. The Transfiguration is not controversial. He's not a particularly controversial fella. Now, Michelangelo, on the other hand, that's a different story. He's a different story. And he was very adamant about getting what he wanted and telling the Pope he couldn't come up to see it till it was done. And there's a possibility he put a little angel on the wall flipping a very naughty gesture at the Pope. I mean, Michelangelo's a different story and got away with it for Michelangelo-esque reasons. Okay, I'll give you one more example and then we can go. There's a book called, which I shared as one of the nonfiction books, which is called Secrets of the Sistine. I'm almost there. Right here. The Sistine Secrets. Sorry, Michelangelo's Forbidden Messages in the Heart of the Vatican. It's very conspiracy theory-esque. It's not all, some of it's a little questionable, but it's a really fascinating read. And so if you're interested in mean stuff being created in the church under the Pope's nose, it's this book. It's The Sistine Secrets by Michelangelo. If someone has heard of Raphael thumbing his nose at the Pope, please let me know. Can't fathom it. Don't know of an example.
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie. We certainly look forward to the next art history thriller. And thank you all for our attendees for joining us tonight. And thank you again for Stephanie. And we will definitely look forward to your next book and hopefully have you back at the Hudson Library in person next time.
Exactly. Next time we will all be back in person and we can sign books and we can hang out and we can be in the same room. Yay.
Yeah, and don't forget, if you are interested in a copy of her latest book, Raphael, Painter in Rome, the Learned Owl in Hudson, or small bookshop in the city here, they have copies of her book with signed nameplates, so you can have an autographed copy of her latest novel. Thank you all so much. Take care.
Bye.
Please bring all items